Hello everyone and welcome back to Boater Plays Something. Today we are playing Thera Awakening, the prequel novella to Stonekeep. When we last left off at the end of Chapter 6, our heroes had infiltrated Kalkaroth and had managed to rescue Jen as well as an old blind Throg. They made to escape with Orvig. Wraith and Kel stayed behind to fight. Kel fell and Wraith has been captured. So let us see what happens as we go into the final chapter of this novella and see how things play out. I'm Boater. Let's read something. Thera Awakening by Steve Jackson and David Pulver. Chapter 7. Wraith awoke in darkness, his wounds afire to the feel of cold, wet stone against his body. He was curled into a fetal position, and he ached everywhere, a mass of cuts and bruises. The worst was his shield arm. He winced when he touched it. It wasn't broken, but it felt like a bone bruise. He remembered the fight, the sight of Calandra going down. Her high scream as a spear pierced her shoulder. What happened next had been almost welcome after that scream. But now he lived, and he did not know if Kel did, or Orvig. Wincing, he staggered to his feet. The ceiling was too high to touch, the walls close. He was in a small cell only an arm span across, perhaps the very one they'd rescued Jen from. He was alone. He'd never been alone before, not like this. The stone walls muffled every sound. The only thing in the cell was a wooden bucket of tepid water. There was no room to stretch out. He thought of ways to escape, made ingenious plans, but in the end they all depended on him leaving the cell. He could feel no doorway, and any roof hatch was too high for him to reach. He tried yelling. He called for Calandra and Orvig and even Jen. He shouted insults at his captors, cursed his jailers and Gotha Karn. He got no answer. He expected none. He stopped when his throat became too hoarse to speak. That paragraph right there, that 3.5 lines, is a really good example of just being, I can't think of the word, discerning, of not putting in a ton of detail when you don't need to. Like I don't know if they had a length requirement for this, or if they just said, let's keep it short, or if they just said, look, he's there in the cell, he's not doing nothing, but there was nothing he could do, and he did that whole typical yell, whatever. Meanwhile, other books that I've read might have gone a little more into depth about what he yelled, or some of the thought processes of how he got there. Certainly Wolf and Parchment, which I've read, would have him yell one insult, about a paragraph and a half of ruminating, yell another insult, maybe in the Throg language, and then think about it a little more, and then call for help. You get the idea. Novella, it does so concisely. 3.5 lines. He yelled, but nothing came of it. Hours passed. He played the battle out in his mind, move by move, thought of different things he might have done, tactics that did not end with Calandra of Adra lying bleeding at his feet. He beat the stone walls until his right hand was bloody. More time passed. Eventually he sat, wrapping his arms around his knees, and tried to sleep. Sleep was like death, he thought. Eventually, it came. Wraith woke. In the blackness of the cell, he had no idea how much time had passed. His wounds still ached, but not as badly. His knuckles hurt. He remembered what he had done. He no longer felt tired, although his stomach rumbled and his throat was parched. He drank the remaining water in the bucket, then used it to relieve himself. He thought of Calandra. Orvig might have survived. Orvig was a survivor. But Calandra, he'd seen her fall. And the Throgs, they hated her. If she'd lived, what would they do to her? There had to be a way to help her. If she was alive, was in a cell like this, what would she be doing? Something magical, he guessed. He curled up on the cold floor. What could he do? They'd taken his sword and dagger, his helmet, even his boots. All he had left was the coarse Throg tunic and breeches. He looked at his finger. Even his mother's ring was gone. Did it now adorn some Throg's finger? It had been the focus of what little magic power he might have inherited. Without it, without weapons, he was helpless. He closed his eyes, thought of his mother. She'd vanished on a nameless quest. Had she too perished in some bleak pit on the edge of the world? Would he ever know? The ring was the only thing left of her. He imagined the rune, Thera's rune. Where was it now, he thought. He could see it in his mind, unflawed, bright, intricate, the temple in his dream, the ring, black obsidian and gold, a heavy weight curled about his finger. Wraith opened his eyes. Unbelieving, he stared at his right hand. The ring. It was back on his finger. He'd called it back. I've been planning that for a while. He had little time to think about it. Suddenly there was a loud crash above him. The ceiling opened and a faint radiance spilled down. Light! Wraith looked up, and was met with a wash of ice-cold water that almost knocked him to his knees. Shivering with cold, Wraith cursed and was rewarded with Throg laughter. But instead of slamming the trapdoor shut, they threw down a rope. "Jar!" a voice commanded. Wraith didn't know the word, but the meaning was crystal clear. Ignoring the pain in his limbs, he climbed. As he neared the top, rough hands reached for him, and he yelped as they touched his bruises. He stood in a chamber, surrounded by a dozen copper-helmed bullies. They twisted his arms behind his back, tying them with a coarse length of rope. "Aznab!" one of them ordered, shoving him. He nearly fell, but regained his balance. The Throgs guarding him spoke little, though he recognized a few words. Javaka Ray was repeated several times in nervous tones, and once he heard Wero, which he thought Orvig said meant dwarf. They didn't seem to be talking about him. He tried to say something in his halting Throg speech, but was rewarded by a sharp blow across the mouth. Then he was force-marched through winding corridors and up 2 flights of stairs. Down a wide corridor where curious faces peeped from curtained doorways, but drew back when the guards glared at them. Down a wide corridor where curious faces peeped from curtained doorways, but drew back when the guards glared at them. Finally, he stood in front of an open archway, flanked by 2 hulking warriors. They bore long spears and shields, and wore leather armor sewn with iron scales. Full helms covered their faces, shaped to resemble the heads of Samara. As the party approached, they crossed their spears to bar the entrance. "Subal Gatha Karn," came the challenge, slightly muffled by the guard's mask. "Skasias Gatha Karn," answered the warrior, holding Wraith's arm. The spears lifted. Wraith was marched through. Wraith was dragged into a wide hall, its walls covered with shields, weapons, and the skulls of great animals. Bears and wolves, stags and great cats, mutant forest creatures that had no names. Tables were shoved against either wall, and seated on benches were a score of copper-helmed warriors. Their heads swiveled to stare at Wraith as he entered. At the far end of the room, a third table stood facing the door, on a raised platform. At it sat 2 warriors, both wearing the full-helmed insect masks, though these were pushed back so Wraith could see the Throg faces under them. Between them sat the hooded, youthful Throg who had directed the battle. He gazed down at Wraith, face twisted into a mocking smile. But he seemed nothing more than a cruel child, overshadowed by the figure seated next to him. Wraith stared, knowing he saw his enemy face to face. "I am Gatha Karn, shaman and war chief of the Unemaka, master of the Whispering Death." The speaker was a Throg of middle years, tall but very thin, his skin stretched like parchment over his skull. The Throg's eyes were oval, almost too large for his narrow face, which is definitely not what we see in the illustration. What else is new? He wore a white cloak of eagle feathers, spotted with red stains, and around his neck was a sun-shaped amulet of beaten gold. In one hand he held a staff, and Wraith stared, for atop the staff was mounted a life-size skull, a head carved from black glass. Its forehead was carved with the same rune that marked the Samara. Gotha Karn tilted his head sideways, exchanged a whisper with the coiled youth beside him. Then he leaned forward. "My son Parlock tells me you led the warriors who attacked Karkolroth." With a gesture, he waved back the men holding Wraith. "Approach me, Outlander. Give me your name." "I am Wraith of Stonekeep, acting watchmaster of Fort Thunder," Wraith replied. "Where are my comrades?" "The female?" Gotha Karn said. There was a whisper, a susurrus of voices. Wraith thought he heard the word Jedi Keen whispered back and forth. But Gotha Karn raised his hand, and there was silence. "Is she your mate, then?" When Wraith gave no answer, he paused, studied Wraith's face. "I thought so. Well, Wraith of Stonekeep, she still lives," Karn said. "Whether she continues to do so depends on you. Do you understand?" "I hear you," said Wraith. "When my Samara first spotted your spies trespassing in my lands, I was filled with wrath." "Spies?" said Wraith, outraged. "You mean our traitors?" "Spies!" repeated Gotha Karn. "Though some of my counselors were cowardly, urging me not to strike, they remembered battles in years gone by when your dwarf-armed warriors bested ours. But those fools were living in the past, a time before Gotha Karn." Yes, the Samara," said Wraith casually. The speech had given him time to regain his composure. "I suppose your creatures were good enough against unsuspecting traitors, but our soldiers dealt with them easily enough." Gotha Karn started to snarl, but then he laughed. "Wraith of Stonekeep, I recognize you, you know. It was you who rallied your warriors, drove off my whispering death, was it not?" He paused and stroked the crystal skull. "Yes, I watched you. I was looking through my creatures' eyes as they died. I thought I'd killed you then, but it seems you lived. Well, but there are few left of your warband now, are there? Where are the others? Dead, perhaps? You and that foolish dwarf are the only ones left." Wraith hung his head, but inside he felt a grim satisfaction. He'd learned what he wanted to know. The shaman didn't know that Tam, Quinn, and Lorik had survived. Or he knew that they survived and he's killed them already. Whatever happened, Stonekeep would be warned against the Whispering Death. In Orvig, it sounded like he was still free. "He still eludes you, then?" Wraith hazarded. "The dwarves? They won't get far. Dwarves are like rats. Hiding in dark places comes naturally to them." "Why do you use that as an insult, Throg?" "But they are little danger." He stared at Wraith. "At first I thought to feed you to the Samara, you know," the shaman said conversationally. "But I was impressed by your bravery as a warrior, ineffectual as it was. You sent 3 of my guards to Throggy's halls, and 4 others will never fight again." "Shame," said Wraith. Karn made a dismissive gesture. "If they lost to a pair of humans, I do not need them. But in defeating them, you showed yourself a worthy adversary, Wraith of Stonekeep." He laughed, high and mocking. "Maybe your people are worthy of honor." He eyed Wraith. "What do you say to that, Wraith of Stonekeep?" "You were right in that," said Wraith. He turned Gotha's words over in his mind, unsure what game the shaman was playing. "My people have honor." Sorry, voices. "Good, good," said Gotha. "It is well to have agreement. But I must be sure, and my people must have proof." "What kind of proof?" asked Wraith warily, sensing a trap. Gotha turned to his warriors. "This is Wraith of Stonekeep," he told them, speaking first in his own language, then repeating his words so that Wraith could understand them. I feel like this is something where there should be he should only be speaking in Frog speak, and there should be a translator, because it seems odd for him to stoop down and translate for him when none of the others are recognizing it, but basically Wraith needs to know what's going on, so anyway. "One of their war chieftains. Are the people of Stonekeep worthy to be our allies, or crawling worms to be crushed? What shall we do? Taila tua Jisroth! One of the copper-helmed guards shouted. The cry was taken up by the others. Aye, the trial of Throgi, said Gotha. If the Outlander proves himself worthy, I shall send him forth as an emissary, to deliver our words to the Stone Dwellers. If they wish our friendship, they must acknowledge our dominion over the Vale of Kara, and pay us tribute to cut our trees. But if he dies, we will know the folk of the keep are as weak as the villagers, fit only to be slaves, or fodder for the Samara. What say you, my warriors? Gotha, they chanted, Kias Jaisroth! Yes, the trial. What is the trial of Throgi? Said Wraith suspiciously. A simple one of skill and bravery, I think, said Gotha in a soothing voice. You must face a beast of the forest, armed only with a short blade. He turned to his son, whispered something. The coiled youth grinned and scurried away. What beast? Said Wraith. His stomach sank. One of your Samara? Do you think I am unfair, Wraith of Stonekeep? Don't answer that. He laughed, knowing Wraith's answer. No, you face a lesser beast. Take him to the circle. Two warriors grabbed his arms. Wait, O Karn! Wraith shouted. What of the dwarves in Kalandra? If I pass this test, they must go free too. There was sudden silence. Gotha stroked the black skull and pursed his lips. Very well, he said at length. The two dwarves are spies, but harmless. As for that girl, if you slay the beast, you may take her back with you. We shall not harm her. You have my oath word. Thank you, great Karn, said Wraith. I believe the word is chaos. No, that's yes. Thank you is something else. Anyway. He let out a deep breath. Would Gotha break a promise made in front of his men? He hoped not. He would try his best to win. But what was this beast? To Wraith's surprise, his guards didn't take him to the circle immediately. Circle... Is this just the circle? Da-da-da-da. Yeah, just the circle. Okay. I was confused because it says take him to the circle before when Gotha said to do that, but it was lowercase c circle. Now this is uppercase C. Take him to the circle immediately. Anyway, to Wraith's surprise, his guards didn't take him to the circle immediately. Rather, he was led to a small room, and there given a sip of water and a few scraps of dry bread. Did someone say water? He was kept there for a long time, then led away and manhandled up a ladder. He felt a breeze blowing through his hair. With a start, Wraith realized he was outside, in Karkelroth's courtyard. Overhead, the waning moon stood 3/4 full, enthroned by stars. Its light glinted on the blades of it. It's not a full moon anymore, look at that. Its light glinted on the blades of the warriors surrounding him, and on the wings of a dozen Samara, who watched from their perches atop the battlements. But there was more than moonlight in the courtyard. A strange pale glow was visible somewhere up ahead. The shaman sat on a short tripod. In his left hand he held the crystal skull. The glow radiated from the skull's eyes, a silver light bright as a full moon. As they dragged him forward, Wraith concentrated on the crystal skull, bringing his mage sight to bear on it, and staggered. He shrieked, dropped to his knees. Sharp pain in his neck, a sense of dislocation, a soul-felt agony of loss, of separation, of humiliation. "Stop!" Wraith shouted. Thinking he'd been screaming in terror, the Throgs laughed and dragged him on. Wraith tore his gaze away. It ended. He gasped for breath and opened his eyes. He found himself standing on the lip of a pit, lit by the skull's silver glow. It was about a half-dozen paces across and 10 feet deep, its floor covered with packed earth. And within it, Wraith caught his breath. He was looking at a wedge-shaped head nearly as big as his own. Its mottled scales glistened coldly. The green slit-pupiled eyes met his gaze and held it, unblinking. The head sat atop a coiled body, as thick as his leg, nearly 20 feet long. It was a giant serpent. Wraith thought back to the snakeskin he and Orvik had found outside Adra. Outside Alda. Outside Adra. Thank you, editor. The pattern was similar. It could easily have been shed by this monster. Across the circle, the wind carried Gotha Karn's laughter. Beside him, Wraith could see Parlock grinning, as if at some private joke. Then the shaman raised his hand, and Wraith felt his bonds being severed. A spear jabbed his back, and he was shoved forward. Rather than topple, he jumped, landing bent knees on the packed earth. No, he's got to do that spin and grab the diving board and pop back up and grab the lightsaber that R2 pops out of his head. Lightsaber, sword, whatever. What about the sword? He shouted. Gotha nodded. A warrior leaned forward, tossed a blade to him hilt first. Wraith caught it. He nodded approvingly. It was a deadly tool, a bone-handled iron sword with a heavy stabbing blade. Not steel, but still sharp. But against that snake? He would do it. For Kalandra, and maybe even for Stonekeep if pandering to Gotha Karn's ego could help stop a war. Wraith edged around slowly. Above him, the wind groaned. No, not the wind. The Throgs had begun a low sing-song chant, a deep moaning sound. The snake heard it too. It hissed and swayed slightly, forked tongue flickering in and out, as if reluctant to attack. Perhaps the sound disoriented it, Wraith thought. How should he fight a giant snake? Was it poisonous? I think the word you're looking for is venomous. If it was, a single scratch could mean the end. If not, if it was just a constrictor, it would seek to bite him anyway, and hold him while the coils crush his life out. Either way, then, it would try to bite. He would have to stab at the head while it struck at him. Wraith decided he would aim for the eye, or failing that, for the tongue. The scales might be tough to penetrate. He rocked forward on the balls of his feet. The packed earth was slightly slippery, but with bare feet, not dangerously so. I just realized I probably had the image up alongside here, although I just turned to it, and that is not a snake head the size of his head. That is, I mean, he's got some hams, but that is still much thicker than his thighs. So, just pointing out, I like the illustration. It doesn't quite fit the descriptiveness in the text. The snake seemed reluctant to attack. Wraith stepped in and lunged for the eyes, hoping to find a weak point. The snake dodged, but only just, his blade passing inches from the arcing neck. It coiled above him, hissing like one of Orvik's steam kettles. Wraith leapt back, guessing it would strike, but instead it circled, weaving to the left. Again Wraith attacked, feinting for its head, then spinning sideways to slash at his neck. But once more it outguessed him, sliding out of range, weaving about him, elegant as a dancer. There was something almost hypnotic about its movements, and with a start Wraith realized that it was playing with him, not attacking, trying to tire him out. He looked into its unblinking emerald eyes and nodded. "Creature of the forest," he asked it silently, "have you hunted men or Throgs before, ere the Throgs took you for their sport? We are alike in this, but one of us must die." Wraith circled it, slowly, the point of his blade extended, making cautious, probing attacks. It dodged them easily, but now Wraith was learning its pattern, the steps of the sinuous dance it wove about him. He almost had it, and he raised his blade knowing that it would move just so, and he would strike then, and it would die. And suddenly, the pattern was clear. A dance. Wraith's mind floated back to the hut in the village, to Kel, interweaving her dance with the serpent Akeshi, and Wraith knew. He stepped forward, but instead of using his sword, he struck with the finger of his right hand, his ring finger. He held a vision of Thera's rune burning in his mind, and I'm trying to just extend the one finger, I guess. Why can't I can do that over here? Oh god, the human hand has weird tendons and attachments and stuff. This finger. I guess probably like this. Boop! He stepped forward, but instead of using his sword, he struck with the finger of his right hand, his ring finger. He held a vision of Thera's rune burning in his mind, and he willed not to see, but to restore. The body of the snake flowed like water, and became Kel. She stood in front of him, her dark hair flowing about her like a cloak, emerald eyes sparkling. Wraith dropped his sword and took her into his arms. Then together they turned to face the shaman, Gotha Karn. "It didn't work, Karn!" Wraith shouted. "Your illusion failed. You wanted me to kill her? What of your oath? You wanted me to kill her, exclamation point, but, either way. I promised I would not harm her if you won, the shaman said. He forced a laugh. If you killed her, what is that to me? But you have failed the test. The snake, the Jedi King, still lives. Unless you'd like to kill her now. The snake is gone, O Karn, cried Wraith angrily. I saw your trick, and I dispelled it with one blow. Where is your honor, O Karn? No, end quote. The Throg warriors murmured. Did Wraith hear agreement in their voices? Kill her now and go free, cried Karn angrily, or die. I'd rather die, said Wraith. He felt Kel's arms tighten around him. Very well, said Gothic Karn. He turned to his son. Parlock, take them back to the pits. I want a suitable demise planned for them for tomorrow's feast. He grinned. Be imaginative, or you'll be joining them. The shaman stood. Chaos, said Parlock. He gestured. The warriors closed in. I mean, you could just kill them right then and there, but no, gotta be a villain about it. The cell, barely big enough for one, was cramped with both of them in it. Wraith didn't mind. Gently, he touched Kel's shoulder. There was no sign of a wound. Don't worry, said Calandra. I won't break. You're all right, Wraith said wonderingly. But the spear wound. Haven't you guessed? Kel said bitterly. My secret? The snake, Wraith said slowly. It wasn't an illusion after all, was it? No, Kel answered. She turned her face away. I'm accursed. A shapeshifter. A were-snake. She grimaced. Jedi Keen, she said. Slithering terror. We heal fast when we change shape. It doesn't matter, Wraith said. Gently, he took her face in his hands, turned her to face him. He kissed her. She responded. They didn't speak for a long time after that. Then, they slept. I was the shaman's daughter, you see, Kel told him. She'd begun talking soon after they awakened. She was nestled in his arms, and he stroked her hair as she spoke. I had the power and been training from childhood, but I made a mistake. I got arrogant. There was a youth from Gothmeg, older than me. I liked him, but he had his own lover. I used my magic to change his feelings about her, but my spell was too strong. His love twisted to hate. He hurt her. Oh, Kel, said Wraith. He hugged her. You were how old then? 15, Kel said. It's easy to be jealous when you're young. There shouldn't be an end quote there, because she keeps talking in the next paragraph, but whatever. The shaman found out. I was brought before the village elders. They said I'd acted like a serpent. Some wanted to kill me, stone me to death, but a wandering priestess was visiting. A priestess of Thera. Strong in rune magic. You can guess the rest. Kel, this Theran priestess, Wraith asked. He stopped, not daring to hope. Was it? Yes. Her name was Ray. She must have been your mother. I only met her for a few hours. I never saw her again, but I guess I owe her my life. Shouldn't be an end quote, next paragraph. After that, I was in exile. I lived outside the village. Then the Samara came. You know the rest. How often do you change? Wraith asked. For years and years, I was a snake all the time. Wraith, I was 15 when you were a baby. The snake's body, it doesn't anger, and it doesn't age. Ray put me there to learn patience. Oh, love, I needed that lesson. As I mastered myself, I learned to master my shape as well. Now it's only during a full moon that I have trouble holding human form. That's why I ran away the first time we met. It was my skin you found. She frowned. Gothic Karn used his rune skill to force me to change. Rune skull to force me to change, and he broke it with Thera's rune. Yes, said Wraith. That skull, it's connected with Thera somehow. Wraith hesitated, then went on. Your curse was crafted by a Theran priestess, my mother. In the ring, the skull, the image of the Samara. All visions of the rune on the floor of the great temple, the temple in my dream. Sorry. And the ring, the skull, the image of the... Oh my god. And the ring, the skull, the image of the Samara, all versions of the rune on the floor of the great temple, the temple in my dream. It could be, said Kel, but that temple, you saw it ruined, and the rune breaking, shattering? Yes, said Wraith, but listen, the Throg girl said Gotha Karn took the skull from an ancient temple. I think it's the same one, a temple of Thera. And because Thera's rune is broken, it can be defiled, and his powers twisted and stolen by Gotha Karn. That's quite the leap for someone that doesn't know anything about rune magic, but okay, we'll go with it. Kalandra frowned. What? Said Wraith. I just realized something. It's been quite a while. Aren't we late for our execution? As if to punctuate her words, the walls shook slightly, and they heard a muffled crash. Earthquake! Wraith shouted, raised in Stonekeep he knew no greater terror. Wait, said Kel. That didn't feel like a quake. She sniffed. I smell smoke. The trapdoor creaked open. Smoke was everywhere. Through the fumes they saw a green face, a Throg wearing a leather helmet and a yellow neck scarf. He peered down. Liu Saruki, Wraith! He shouted. He swiped at the vapor, coughing. Wraith tried to reply but choked in the smoke. He settled for a vigorous nod. The Throg coughed again, grinned, and lowered down a rope. By the time they'd climbed out, the smoke was slowly clearing. The door to the prison chamber seemed to have been blown off its hinges as if by a mighty wind. Splinters of charred wood mingled with bodies and parts of bodies. Wraith saw dented copper helmets and guessed the dead were Gotha Karn's guards. But there were half a dozen live Throgs in the room, males and females of all ages. Some of their rescuers wore armor, others had none. They had one thing in common. They wore yellow scarves and carried swords, spears, and axes, and all had a grim light in their eyes. When they first went down to the dungeons, they were passed by a couple with yellow scarves. They were messengers? I'm not quite sure. It's never really explained what they were, but they could have been, communicating in the resistance or something. A red-stained bandage was wrapped around the leader's shoulder. It didn't seem to bother him. Wraith recognized him as one of the partying Throgs, one of those who'd refused to toast Gotha Karn. Wero Horjunjamu! The bandaged Throg said proudly. Seeing Wraith's lack of comprehension, he frowned, then said in halting trade talk, We use dwarf-made thunder barrel! He gestured widely with both arms. Badoom! Wraith stood, astonished, then a slow smile spread across his face. He turned to Zhen. By which I think you mean Kel? Because Zhen's not in the scene? He turned to Kel. Orvig's alive! Urasruki Ormendarn, he said. I am Ormendarn, Wraith mentally translated. Follow! We take you to Dwarf and new Shaman! The Throgs let Wraith and Kalandra grab weapons from the dead guards, then hurried them through the corridors. The battle was still raging. The Throgs moved quickly but cautiously, warily scanning each intersection, then dashing down straight passages. They heard shouts and screams, and running footsteps, and once a distant explosion. Several times they stepped over bodies. Many of them wore copper helmets, but many did not. They found Orvig in a wide chamber. He was standing at a table, staring at what looked like a map, surrounded by a half-dozen armed Throgs. The dwarf looked tired, but unhurt. Ormendarn marched up to him. Wero, he said. Guards, Orvig replied absently. Then he looked up. Wraith, he shouted, and hugged him. He looked at Kel, then hugged her too. Laughing, Kel returned the embrace. Orvig pulled back and shook the Throg's hand. Thank you, Ormendarn. It went well? Well, the Throg said. He gave a tusky grin. I go now, said Ormendarn. Kill more bug lovers. Orvig, what's happening? Said Wraith. Can't you guess? Orvig said. The revolution? He laughed. Turns out quite a few Throgs didn't like Gotha Karn's leadership, or his high and mighty copper-headed thugs. They want to go back to the old days, when Throgs fought their battles without insects, and leaders had honor, and everyone was equal under the shaman. Shavaka Ray's doing? Wraith guessed. Top marks, me boy! Another distant explosion shook the walls. And Jen and I made a few tricks as well. We stone melters know a few things about chemistry. He grinned. How'd you get away, Orvig? How'd you get away, Orvig? Asked Kel. The secret passages I mentioned. Javakaray's a canny old bird. He knew them all. He built most of them. We used them to slip past Karn's guards. So while Karn busied himself tormenting you and Kalandra, Javakaray was contacting his partisans. We struck 2 hours ago. It took time to fight our way down here. I'd been wondering, Wraith said, why did Gotha Karn and his son leave Ray alive? It seems foolish. Jen told me, Orvig said. Karn got most of his magic from the crystal skull. He has power, but not knowledge. He'd been trying to force Javakaray to tell him how things work. He thought that blinding the old man would make him harmless. Orvig laughed shortly. But as harmless as a boot for a scorpion full of scorpions. Glad he's on our side. How's the fight going? Wraith asked. Hard to say, said Orvig. Gotha was taken by surprise. He hadn't thought Javakaray would move so fast. Hadn't realized how hated he was. The rebels have numbers, but Gotha's guards have better weapons, and the Whispering Death only obey him. He's barricaded in the upper part of the stronghold with about 50 of his followers. Old Javaka and 60 Throgs are outside, besieging him. Everyone else is lying low. Orvig sighed. It'll be bloody. The siege could take days. Ormindarn and another Throg had just re-entered the room, pushing a shuffling line of bound prisoners. Wraith recognized one of the faces. Parlok Karn, the shaman's son. Plan crystallized. Days? Maybe not, Wraith said. I think I have an idea. Every time I see Parlok in the text here, for some reason, in my head, it immediately becomes Patrick, and I have to pull it back. I don't know why. It starts and ends the same, so just the middle letters are a little different. So Patrick Karn! They stood halfway up the volcano, Throgskel Edoric Alkar, the eye that had once burned. Last night, Gotha Karn's son had led them to it, spurred by Kel's hissing threats and his own desire to ingratiate himself to Javakaray. Wraith had been right. The man who thrust his own guard onto an enemy's sword had been happy to betray his father to save his own life. Wraith had been daunted by the prospect of scaling the volcano, but Parlok, desperate to win favor, had shown him a narrow stone path, cunningly hidden, that wound its way up the mountain's rocky slopes. The climb had been easy. The path had taken them to a stone door, the entrance to the temple. This is the place your father spoke of? Wraith asked. Chaos, said Parlok, with a poor imitation of enthusiasm. Now it was dawn. The morning sun had just appeared over the volcano's peak, warm and bright. It was the first sunrise Wraith or Kalandra had seen in 2 days. With Orvig, they traveled hard through the night. Now the 3 friends enjoyed a moment's rest, their goal in sight, savoring the feel of sun and wind on their bare arms. The Throg kneeling at their feet obviously didn't appreciate it. He covered his eyes and moaned softly. Get up, Parlok Karn, Wraith told him. It's only the sun. The sunlight illuminated a great archway, cut into the living rock of the mountainside. Columns stood on either side. One had fallen into ruin. The other depicted a many-branched tree. Let's go inside, Wraith said. He glanced back at Orvig and Kel. It's odd, he told them. I feel like I'm coming home. Wraith walked through a huge echoing space, as dark as a womb. At first he thought he drifted, but then Orvig lit a lamp, and they were in a columned hall, and Wraith realized the slippery floor was solid under him, thick black glass. Around them was darkness, as though they stood on a pedestal within the cave. Ahead were fallen columns, scattered debris, piles of rubble that might once have been statues. Wraith caught glimpses of delicate faces, of animal limbs, of fragments of shapes he could not imagine, and ached to know what the statues had been, what they had meant. So much was lost. Underfoot crunched shards of broken glass from the lamps that Wraith knew had fallen long ago. But the temple, though damaged, was not destroyed. A pattern was etched in the glass floor, delicate carved lines that caught the light of Orvig's lamp gleaming. With a start, he realized he was following it, and he laughed, for he had done this once before. The rune forms a word, Wraith told the others, a name. Thera's true name. There should be an end quote there. He glanced back at the entrance. I came through this arch before, he said wonderingly. Only, I was fleeing the temple, not entering it. It's like I'm walking through a dream. You are, replied Cal. Thera's dream. She gestured ahead, where the floor was cracked, and shards of glass lay scattered. See where the rune is broken? We'll fix it, promised Wraith. If Shavaka Ray wins, he'll help us. Aye, said Orvig. We have your ring for the template. We'll bring in artisans and make it whole if we can. But not yet. Let's carry on with your plan, boy. We have a war to win. He looked pensive. I'm worried about Jin. The dwarf girl had stayed with Shavaka Ray, helping the old shaman prepare for the offensive they planned for the morrow. Wraith turned to Parlock, who stood trembling beside him. Show us where the skull was, he ordered. The statue lay toppled near the altar, not shattered like the others, just headless. A skeleton, every tiny bone in perfect detail, carved from the black glass formed in the volcano's heart. Once it had stood man-high, a last guardian, an image of death serving the temple of life. But some power had overcome it, left its head severed for a greedy magicker to find. My father didn't break it, Parlock said, echoing Wraith's thoughts. He found the skull on the ground beside it. He sensed its power. It was still alive. But who did it? Calandra asked. Someone must have broken the statue. Defeated it. But who did it? Calandra asked. Someone must have broken the statue. Defeated it. But why did they just leave the head? I don't know, Wraith said. Perhaps... He stepped forward and touched the statue. It was cool. Smooth. He concentrated, focusing on his ring, on the rune, willing himself to pierce the veil of time. He felt himself sinking. Wake up, boy, said Orvig. He shook him. Wake up! Wraith realized he'd fallen to his knees. He looked up, met his friend's worrying eyes. I'm all right, Wraith said. He brushed sweat from his brow. I saw it. What did you see? Said Orvig. Wraith was still shaking his head. It was veiled, shadowed, but I saw a little. He glanced at Calandra. You sensed it when you cast the runes... When you cast the runes day before. You sensed it back when we cast the runes. You warned us, a third force, hidden by illusions, veiled in lies, mad, greedy, amused by death. There should be an end quote. I remember, said Orvig. He shuddered. What was it? I don't know exactly, said Wraith. Sometimes it seemed huge, battling the crystal statue, then small, like an evil goblin hiding in the dark, hiding the skull so Gothic Harn would find it and become his pawn. Wraith shook his head. I don't know what it was, what it wanted. Maybe just mischief. Whatever it wanted, said Kel. It's gone now. She looked at the statue. Orvig, Kel, help me lift it. Together they heaved the headless skeleton to its feet. Wraith half expected the glass bones to rattle and move, but the statue was solid and heavy. What do you plan? Said Calandra. Wraith raised his ring so it caught the light of Orvig's lamp. He remembered the spell he had unknowingly performed in the dungeon to call back the stolen ring. A simple spell, said Wraith, for we are simply restoring what has been. A spell of calling, and of renewal. Hold on, if you know such a thing, why couldn't you just use it on the rune floor? Whatever. He stepped back behind the statue. Hold my hand, he told Calandra, and think of Thera's rune. He touched the statue. And imagine it whole. Look at the statue, and imagine it as it should be. In the dark depths of Kalkaroth, dawn had brought no end to the battle. Perhaps Gothic Harn had sensed something far away, or maybe he sought revenge for the capture of his son. Whatever the reason, in a burst of mad fury he had sallied forth, throwing all his remaining Samara and copper-helmed guards against the rebel forces in an all-out frenzy. Taken by surprise, Shavaka Ray's warriors fell before the wave of chitin and steel. Now their barricades were down, and they were fighting for their lives. Now the battle raged through the Great Hall. The fighting was too close to use the thunder barrels. Many rebels had broken and ran. Others had died fighting. Ormandarn and a handful of warriors remained before their blind chief, weapons ready, waiting to die in Javaka Ray's defense. With them stood a small dwarf girl, eyes determined, holding a sword with both hands. Secure behind a wall of guards, Gothakarn laughed, exultant. Javaka Ray was doomed. He was still the true shaman. A dozen fresh Saemara hovered above him, wings buzzing. He held his skull aloft and pointed to the small knot of defenders, willing the insect creatures to rend and tear and slay. He began to give the order, and the skull turned in his hands, its eyes burning into his. A soundless cry of exultation shook the room. Then Gothakarn's hands were empty. Thunderstruck, the shaman stood there. Gone! His power was gone! He felt his control go, magical webs fading like shadows in the hated sun. "Wahuka!" he screamed, half a prayer, half a curse. "You swore!" Then he felt psychic leashes snapping, the breaking of magical chains that bound a dozen savage wills. The Saemara struck at the thing that had bound their souls. The last thing Gothakarn heard was the whisper of death. When I read this a bunch of other times, I assumed that Wahuka was just a Throgi curse, but apparently is some sort of entity that we will find when we play Stonekeep, because that was the end of Chapter 7. But we cannot let an epilogue this short go unread. Epilogue. Calandra stretched sinuously on the sleeping furs, then turned to face her lover. Eyes still rolling a little bit. I mean, cute, but at the same time, just very, like, oh, there's a boy, there's a girl, I guess they gotta be in a romance. The downside of the novella is that there's no time for that to actually organically develop. It's just like, hey, you're cute. I know. You're cute too. I know. Let's bang. And bang they did. Calandra stretched sinuously on the sleeping furs, then turned to face her lover. She lit a lamp and studied his face. Wraith seemed older, yet younger too. The lines of care and worry had vanished. Wraith's eyes opened. "I love you, Kel," he said. "Tomorrow we marry," she replied. She stroked his hair. "In the temple." "Tomorrow," Wraith said. He leaned over and kissed her for a long time. She broke away, laughing. "We have a lot to do today, you know. Orvig will be knocking soon." Those were, for some reason, in the same paragraph, even though two different people talked. "He's worked wonders with his new assistant," Wraith said. Reluctantly, he released Calandra. "That Throg girl, Rhiannis. He says she could be master someday. That's a wonder for you, a Throg craftmaster of Stonekeep. And thanks to the stone melter arts, the rune is repaired. Orvig doesn't want to seal the temple. He'd rather everyone can admire his work. His and Rhiannis' work, that is." Said Kel. "I never thought I'd be grateful to Throgs." She moved gently against him. "And I would share but one rune with you." She traced a symbol on his forehead. "Aphros, the rune of love." "Didn't you play with that shit before? Isn't that how you got exiled and been all snaky for a while? Don't. Not with the runes, okay? Take it easy." "But Thera will be good to us," Wraith said. "I can feel it." "I had a dream this night," he said. "A voice came to me. It was Thera." Wraith paused. "I thought we'd won a great war, freed her from Kolkum, but..." "I know," said Kel. "I heard her too." She closed her eyes, recalling Thera's words. "This was just one battle, my children. I am still bound. At most, you loosened a finger just a bit. But I am a goddess. With one finger and enough time, I can do a great deal. How much time? Not in your children's day, or your grandchildren's. But I think, perhaps, one of your grandchildren's children can take the final step with me. You have my blessing for what it's worth, and my promise that your line will endure to fight for me again." And it was so. To be continued in Boater Plays Something, Stonekeep. I really enjoyed sharing this with you guys. My throat is a little hoarse. I kind of did a marathon of recording this whole book in just 2 days. But, excuse me. I had a really good time doing this, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. Please feel free to rate my various accents in the comments below, or just let me know what your favorite part was. If you've played Stonekeep, I'd prefer that you don't give any spoilers because I have not played the game, but I will be doing so. But let me know, if you can do so in a spoiler-free fashion. If you've played it but not read this, what your thoughts were. Hearing this read aloud. I'd love to hear it. So, thank you so much for watching. This has been a different series, but I'm happy to get back to video games starting next week on the same day, which I think will be Thursday, because Thera Thursdays, get it. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, give it that thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and please subscribe for more. You can follow me on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.com/Boaterbug. Watch live at Twitch.tv/Boaterbug, which is where I keep saying follow when I mean subscribe. And you can support the channel through Patreon and Ko-Fi.com/Boaterbug. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a good one, and I will see you next week as we start playing Stonekeep. Bye, everybody!